And I didn't have to ask it. I didn't have to ask.
Okay.
Let me.
Okay. It's on, Sam, whenever you're ready.
All right. No, I'm ready. Good morning. This morning, I think the topic I gave Mendy was Zionism. And, well, if this turns out to be I don't know, however often I get the honor of doing this, what I'm going to, today will sort of be one of those theoretical things. What do the rabbis have to say about it? Oops, hold on, let me get under the table. And then I think the next time I speak will probably be start working our way up to what was the Balfour Declaration? What does it mean? What does it mean today? And how did we get it? Some very, very interesting biographies and stories that go behind it, go up to that. So, as I said today, I wanted to do call it a little more theoretical than anything else. And that means, let me see if I can figure out how to get back to my, no, I don't want to see that. I gotta figure out how to use this a little bit better. Let me, okay. Here's what I want. Okay. I don't know if you can see, I've sort of taken all the faces off, so I really can't see very much because I'm going to read something right off my computer here. I think I did about one of the last times that I spoke. I talked about that there's a Gemara in Ketubas 111a. That was the reason why many rabbis did not were not Zionists. I mean, they davened for it, but they weren't going to tell people to go to Israel. In fact, if you remember at the very end of Fiddler on the Roof, I think everybody's going to America except for one woman who went to Palestine. Just wasn't a popular thing to do. But what we have is, and why weren't the rabbis themselves, the leaders, the spiritual leaders of the communities, talking about it? And I think I would mention that there's a Gemara, Ketubah, and Rab Zera. There was a debate between Rab Zera and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that we can't go until Hashem calls us, basically. And Rab Zera said that what they were talking about, bringing things to the temple, what they were talking about specifically because of the reference in the Gemara was that they were talking about the temple vessels, not the people not going. And what the Gemara pretty much said was that the Jews should not ascend to Eretz Israel en masse. In other words, there should be, there wasn't going to be a parting of the Red Sea and 600,000 people were going to be piling into Eretz Israel, a parting of the Jordan River, as happens in the book of Yehoshua, and they would cross into Israel. That wasn't what was supposed to happen. And one of the other things that would happen was that they would have the approval of the nations. They should have the approval of the nations. Now, and the big proponent of this was the Satmar Rebbe. And I say in all fairness to him, he lost his whole family. I believe he had to rebuild what you see now in Williamsburg and Hiroshima was, I think, was pretty much a re-establishment of his family in this country. They probably have a contingent in Israel. I don't know about that. But the whole story, and he believed that the Shoah itself was caused by the by Zionism. That was the cause of it, and so he was against it. But that was what he seemed to believe in his writings. what I found was something that was interesting was, and I mentioned this before, I'm sure I mentioned it, I have it here next to me, was that the Rav Soloveitchik, I believe, I'm not sure the exact date, but he gave this drasha in 1956. It was the time of the excuse me, of the Suez affair, which I believe that the Egyptians were taking over the Suez Canal. They had blocked the some of the waterways, things that would block the waterways. They were moving troops on as if they were going to attack because, and Israel had gotten together as sort of allies with Britain and France to attack. And Israel actually did attack, and they had took big chunks of the Suez. Uh, and then Eisenhower, the end of it was that Eisenhower said that he was more concerned with the the United States' relationship with the Soviet Union and the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. So he pretty much had, since the Russians were backing the Egyptians, he kind of forced Israel to withdraw its forces. Now, the Rav, in reaction to this, and at about the same time, and I'll only say to leave that was that the issues that was supposedly settled would eventually lead to the Six-Day War, 56, in the next decade, the entire the crisis that led to that. But the Rav spoke, I believe he spoke at YU in the auditorium there, and he was basically addressed the issue of to a good extent of American Jewry and our relationship to Israel. And he takes it back a step further, then talks about the period during World War II, and the Shoah itself, and the fact that well, I'll go through some of the things that he said, but he was basically compared American Jews to Eov, who most people, I'm not sure, I haven't really studied the book of Eov, but he basically relates Eov as I believe it's in a Gemara, and talking about that the three advisors to the Pharaoh, the Paro, one was Bilam, second one was Eov, and the third one was Yitro. And he basically says that what is the Midrash tell us, or the Gemara tell us that Eov does. Eov kind of he doesn't take a stand. He kind of he doesn't advocate for either side. He leaves. He kind of gets out of the way. He doesn't want to be bothered with the whole situation. It's too messy. And that's the end of him. And his activity in the matter is what the Rav says. That's what American Jewry pretty much had been doing up until that point during the war, and perhaps even more strikingly during this time after the war, up until 1956 when he spoke. So what is the Rav's point about about Eretz Yisrael? What does he see? What does he want to be done? What does he point out in his speech? First thing, one of the main things that struck me that he said, that he points to, was that the trembling of fear of geographical integrity. Said if he compares the Nasser, or I think this was before Nasser, possibly, that the leader of Egypt, I think it may have been when a modern day pharaoh, so to speak, he sort of compares this whole idea of the pharaoh that in 1948 that there was an offer made. It actually was made in 47. It was made in 47. And the offer was that there would be a two-state solution. The UN had approved it. So this whole idea in the Gemara that the nations had to approve it, nations approved it. And whatever goes on, the pharaohs by saying no, the Rav compares that to Paro's the hardening of Paro's heart by Paro himself at the beginning and at the end by God with God's help of hardening his heart. It's and because of that, and because of the invasion of by what was there, 6 armies, I think, into the land from the north, southeast, and well, I guess from the east, from the west was the sea, the famous sea that we hear about today. But there was a small Israeli army outnumbered in many places, losing battles. It took a miracle to connect. I think they call it Operation Nachshon that resupplied Yerushalayim. The miracle of that victory. And the size of Israel that we had, talking about pre-67 borders and everything else that goes along with it, went along because of that hardening of the heart that the Rav says, and this idea of, well, they were going to drive the Jews into the sea. That was what the goal that they stated. And they had told many of the Palestinian Arabs, 1948, the Jews were Palestinians also, up until they declared independence and won the war. The Jews, everybody was Palestinians. You'd hear there's a video floating around of Golda Meir saying that her passport when she went overseas prior to the war for independence was as a Palestinian. They were Palestinians. So this whole idea of the hardening of the heart, and the Rav sort of works his way around to talk about in a couple of places, and I'll go through some of the ideas that he has that he comes up with. Great powers. Okay. One of the things he mentions various things that happened, and what got me was that he talks about the Rambam, the great sage Maimonides ruled that the first sanctification of the land of Israel was annulled by a valiant attack of an enemy whose army was vast and armaments numerous, who conquered the land and took it first. In other words, we conquered the land, and it was taken from us by the Babylonians. The second sanctification of the land was carried out through occupation and settlement by divine sanction, toil, and sweat, and was never annulled. I think what he's referring to there is the second settling of the land after the destruction of the first temple. We had the story of Esther. Esther, the Megillah. There was Koresh, Cyrus. A little bit before that, Esther. And then Darius, who allows them to go back and settle the land. That was pretty much what the Rav is saying, is that there was a divine inspiration, God sort of communicating with Cyrus to rebuild the temple, and then later on after Esther, the Darius, and the temple was rebuilt in Jerusalem there. And even though that we were again chased out and conquered, says that the kedusha of the land, okay, it was not taken away from us after that. Okay, and we are, and he says, and he goes through it that there was this, there was a process of, and he uses the word colonization. That's the word he used. In other words, we could have gone. As a matter of fact, American Jewry could have gone back in the day and been pioneers and settled in the land, and that would have accelerated the thing. But there wasn't. In fact, he goes on and points out that even before that, if you look back to the time of the Crusades, the Muslims, the Christians had occupied Jerusalem. They had built a city, and they had built a city, and the land, the whole colony and their thing lasted 100 years. The Christians. In fact, I remember hearing Yasser Arafat saying that, telling the Arabs not to worry. This Jewish state would only last 100 years. It wouldn't do any better than the Christian state. But they couldn't settle the land. They couldn't occupy it. They couldn't make it flourish. They couldn't do anything with it. In fact, even though the Christians were thrown out, they were sent back home. The Arabs couldn't do very much with it, and that included up until the 1890s. There was nobody who was going to settle the land. It was completely unsettled. We have, I believe, what was his name? We have stories anyway of a rather unsettled land. Mark Twain is what I'm thinking of. That there was a completely unsettled land, very little of anything to do. Yes, there were Arabs on the land. I can't deny that there were, but they hadn't settled it. In fact, many of them came after. Many of the ones who would come later on came because the Jews settled it and developed the land and made it blossom. So it would appear, and I've heard people tell me this, that the land was meant for us. We're the only ones who seem to be able to develop it. But up until, but the Rav's point makes a very scary point to some extent, that if the Arabs or somebody had developed it and it had been settled, and there have been people on the land, and perhaps farms and everything else, in the 1800s or even before that, it's very likely, he pretty much says that the Jewish claim, we would have no claim. We really had no claim. The land had been taken or been occupied, had been fully developed, and there was nothing that he's pretty convinced of it. I'll leave it to that. But what happened, of course, was that didn't happen, and you have, in the end, you had a Zionist movement that is finally, that in the 1890s, the political Zionist movement is launched by Herzl, and next time I speak, we'll talk a little bit about Herzl. But the political Zionist movement, the movement of a state, started by Herzl. Now, at the same time, or even before that, there had been a continuous movement of not colonialism, but Christian Zionism. Britain had its Zionists. There, so a novel that was written, and various other things. I think Daniel spoke about Menashe ben Israel. He pops into the story as an important part the foundation of British Jewry and the Christian Zionist movement kind of is sparked by some of that. The United States, in the United States, even from before, they were Bible readers in the United States. The Mayflower Compact is modeled after our covenant to some extent. The high idea of the Declaration of Independence, as we know. John Adams was in favor. In fact, he mentions a Jewish army in some of his writings for various things. I don't remember the exact details of it, but he does mention it. And so that goes on. We hear about General Grant. President Grant, after he leaves office, goes to visit Jerusalem. So does William Seward. There's this whole procession of American Jews. Mark Twain goes and he writes his famous book. So there were various forms of movements that were involved in Zionism. Now there were a couple of steps that the Rav talks about that indicated, the movement, the necessity of going forward, and the miracle. And more importantly, the miracle of 1948, 47, 48, and that whole period. Russia at the UN in 1947, Russia and the Western nations voted at the UN for the state, amazingly enough. But I was a little surprised to see that. But I do know that the second nation right after Truman to recognize the state of Israel was the Soviet Union. And in fact, Stalin, again, this was to counterbalance. He was hoping to counterbalance the British in the Middle East and the oil and everything else, and their influence all over the place. He allowed Czechoslovakia to sell weapons to the Haganah and the Irgun. In fact, if you're familiar with the story of the Altalena, where the Haganah, where the Irgun had bought the guns and they were on the ship, when they those were guns that were from Czechoslovakia. So that was that was the first thing he pointed out. In fact, he models this entire Russia. I should mention after Shiur about the opportunities that were missed. Militarily, the state, as I mentioned before, the state of Israel defeated six armies. Okay, not everything was settled. Part of I believe Ben-Gurion's genius, perhaps, was the fact that he was going to settle the land, the Negev, and all parts of it, so that if there was any question as to whose land it was, the fact that the land was settled. In fact, that was one of the theories, the ideas behind after Israel got the territory in the Six-Day War, putting settlements in strategic places, and I guess call them settlements. They basically built neighborhoods in small cities in Judea and Samaria. And I think the international community has basically called that territory, according to some of the UN resolutions, disputed territories, not occupied territories. one of the things that the Rav also mentions in a religious sense, that many Christian theologists uh, thought were of the theory, and this not all of them, as I mentioned, they were Christian Zionists, and the Christian Zionists believed in Israel coming back to the land, but some Christian Zionists, the theologists, uh, believed that uh, by being thrown out of the land, by being evicted by the Romans, the right of the land, that they replaced the Jews. And there was that idea of replacement theology, the idea of deicide, that we had no right to get the land back, to return to the land. And this whole night in 1948, in 1948 kind of upset the entire apple cart on those people. Uh, there is a story, and we'll get into it in more detail, of Herzl visiting the Pope and asking him for his blessing or something, and he said, "Nope, you guys haven't accepted the Messiah, and so if you come, we're going to have plenty of priests there to baptize you." So that was one of the things that sort of was upset, and it took the church almost until I think 1990 or somewhere in that time to actually come around and recognize the state of Israel. And I think Israel now has is now an embassy or something in the Holy See. In the 1940s, and he wrote this, and I kind of saw the 1960s, that one of the miracles of the 40s was, and the Rav uses the term Hestapanim. And that means, of course, that God had hidden, God's face was hidden. He didn't let us see what was good. He didn't let us see his face. We didn't know what was going on. It's a big phrase in Megillat Esther. In fact, Rav kind of refers to that period, that we acted. Where was God during the Shoah? And suddenly, 2 years later, you had the UN resolution was November 27th, 1947, saying there would be a two-state solution. And this was in spite of all that had happened. And interesting history there that we can get into later on as what led up to the British and their entire situation there, and the war. In fact, what the Rav basically refers to is the whole story of Yonah and the whale, when Yonah basically doesn't want anybody to know who he is. And in the storm, when they ask him what's going on, and he says, "I'm a Yehudi, what did he say? He's an Ivri," and they end up throwing him overboard because they thought that would solve the problem, and he didn't want to acknowledge who he was. And he said that he is his reference to who is as to who is American Jewry. That whole scene. A couple more things. A couple of more things. Probably the most glaring that I see and I hear today, and I'll finish with this, that he says that Jewish blood is not cheap. Okay, and he says, and then he's aware, and he makes a very telling point, saying that what is the deal, Jews, when it says an eye for an eye? What we know what the Gemara says. The Gemara tells us that if somebody came over and punched me in the eye, I can't go over and punch him back. Can't try to do that. That's not the way it works, according to the Gemara. But he says, there are situations. He says when perhaps it is not pointless to go and actually strike back. You are allowed to defend your life and your property. If somebody, last week's Pasha, yesterday we read, if somebody tunnels into your house and the threat is going to kill him, you're allowed to strike first to save your life. No, there's no doubt about that. One of the big things that they learned in the yeshuv prior to, I think it was in the 30s, there was a British officer who came to the yeshuv, and his name is Wingate, I believe, if I remember the story correctly. And he basically instructs the Haganah people, the soldiers there, the Haganah, the pre-IDF, that if they terrorize you, the best thing you could do to prevent another strike is to strike them back. Not necessarily, and he and the British transferred him out. I believe he was in India and someplace else. They transferred him out. They didn't want their officers teaching that kind of thing to the Palestinian Jews at the time. I was going to say Israelis. Okay, but the Rebbe also points out that when Abraham heard that that Lot, his relative, had been taken captive, he goes right to action. Doesn't think twice about it. He goes and rescues him. And he also points out, almost in the same sentence, that when Moshe saw an Egyptian strike a Jew, very early before he's just out of the palace, Moshe strikes him back. He strikes the Egyptian down, and that's the cause of him having to leave Egypt. And because the Paro was looking to execute him, and so he leaves, and eventually ends up with Yitro. So
Sam, a question.
So go ahead.
Yeah.
Was that Milty? How you doing, Milty?
No, it's Jay Hirschman. Anyway, you said,
Good.
thank you. You said allowed, and I'm wondering, is the word allowed or required?
Well, what's what
To fight
is
back.
allowed? Required? I think the Rub used the word allowed. I can look it up. I believe he says allowed. He says I believe he used the word allowed. Is it required to strike back? No, you don't have to strike back. But if you but if you need to, you can. Why would you think it would be required that they would have to be required
I
to
don't
strike
know.
back?
I don't know. I just at some point it becomes pikuach nefesh, but I don't know. I'm just asking.
Well, for Pekuach necklace, you would be allowed. You would be. I guess you could use the word required. But what I think the point is that if somebody is coming to get you, you are allowed to strike first. I think that nobody had a doubt about that in 1967. That the Egyptians had circled them around, and they closed the straits of Tehran. they threw out the UN peacekeeping force. They moved their troops across the canal. It was rather provocative, closing the straits, the waterway, and blocking off all of that. That is an international act of war. Are you required, or should you strike back on that? I think that the crisis there was at such a fevered pitch that in some places they were digging their own graves in case they needed them. This was the fact that they were able to strike so convincingly and turn the tide so quickly. I mean, I remember watching the news on TV from that. It was like, wow. I remember my uncle, who I believe he had liberated some of the camps, looked at it and goes, those Jews know how to fight. And he emphasized the word "those Jews." Yes, you're allowed
Stan,
you're allowed to do what you have to do. In fact, some of what I read here, while he dates this back, as I said, to 1956 when he wrote it, you could, if you had the time, you could rewrite it and apply it to almost every Israeli crisis, especially this one. Andy? Yeah.
Sam,
Yes.
to contrast your opening remarks, I read an article. I'm trying to find it. I just can't. About where people went to after the Holocaust today, right? I think they still have over 200,000. I forgot exactly what the number was. It 260,000 to 40 survivors from the Holocaust. But you know where most of them live? Eretz Yisrael.
And
The majority live in Eretz Yisrael today.
And in this crisis that they're in now, I see on Facebook, which is mostly where I spend a lot of my time here, catching up on what's going on there. I see a lot of Holocaust survivors were taken captive. Some escaped, but they were right down there on the border in the towns right over there. And some of them, you hear them say in videos and things, I thought I'd seen the last of this.
Yeah. I think one of the survivors is 112 years old.
Oh, wow.
I'm just saying, what I'm, and those people who have lived through this before, it's just shocking. It's just shocking. I mean, I grew up, I remember on what was one of those war things, Victory at Sea, or I don't know, one of those things about the war that they would show, and they would show the death camps for the Jews on the in the the videos, and something I didn't mention, but I will say that when the Allied armies went into the camps, whatever the camps they went into, the Eisenhower was the one who went in and brought the cameras in and said he wanted a full documentary, pictures of everything. So sometimes when I read and I see what he, in 1956, his reaction was, they said he was anti-Semitic. I'm not sure about that, but I know he said later on, I know he helped negotiate the deal that eventually the Egyptians broke and led to the 1967 war. But after he was out of office, I guess in the 60s, after he left office, he said he had wished that he had more Jewish advisors to talk to about what was going on, more people who were familiar with what was going on, with Israel and whatever. And it hadn't been a big power tug of war over the Middle East, which I have to tell you, when I saw Putin when I saw Obama allow Putin to get into Syria, I said, wait a minute, I thought we threw him out of there a few years ago. You know, he got tossed out of there. So anyway, but as I promised I would not be political, but that's what he did. Anyway, as I said, the next time I get the opportunity, I'm going to introduce, start talking about the background and
Sam,
of the Balfour Declaration.
2 weeks from tomorrow, you can have Rabbi Markowitz will be in Eretz Yisrael. So
whatever,
2 weeks.
Whenever it comes up, it will be you can tell. I'll tell you what the topic will be: the background of the Balfour Declaration.
Oh, you have to remind me. I'm not going to remember.
Okay, but that's what I want this to lead to. That we understand where we are, where we were, and how we are, and because my blood boils when I hear them say, talk about when I hear the protesters say they want Britain to take back the Balfour Declaration. When I will give you a hint, they did. They did. And I actually have in my house a document that was written in Congress in reaction
There's
to
a
that.
new movies in Hulu. It's about
Anyway.
the family of.
Anyway, have a good day, everybody.
Sam, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Be well, everybody.